Thank you for coming. I'm pleased to introduce the speaker of today, Dr. Peter Bentley. We know each other for more than 10 years, I guess, right? He's a policy advisor at the Innovative Research Universities Australia, which is kind of association for 7 leading universities in Australia. So they have this association, and he works as a policy advisor in that association. And he's the editor-in-chief of one of the leading journals in higher education, Journal of Higher Education Policy and Management. So today he's going to talk about Australian higher education reform. So we will learn a lot from him about Australian higher education with a more comparative perspective, the knowledge that you know from here, and he will talk about Australian higher education. Thank you, Peter, and then the floor is yours.
Okay, thanks, Jisun. I'm not sure if there are people online, but welcome and thanks for the opportunity to talk today. We've got a small audience, so if you have questions, you can ask throughout. I've been told to try to get through it in 40 minutes, and I've got lots of slides, so I'll probably rush through a few. But as Jisun said, I'm a policy advisor with the Innovative Research Universities. Just an overview of the presentation. I'll just talk briefly about the Innovative Research Universities, then the Australian context. I wasn't sure your familiarity with Australian higher education, and then we'll move towards some of the more recent policy developments with a focus on the Australian Universities Accord. I'll also refer to some of the kind of classic literature or typologies for understanding higher education coordination and where this might fit. So the Innovative Research Universities, 7 universities spread geographically across Australia. Australia had a fairly typical approach towards higher education massification. If you're familiar with Martin Tro's work, we moved from a rather elite system in the early 1900s with our first universities established in the late 1800s. Those are the ones like University of Sydney, University of Melbourne, all very geographically oriented. Later in the 1960s and 70s, as higher education became an expectation for the middle classes post-World War II, other universities were being established like ours in the mould of the research and teaching universities of the previous years. So our universities have a strong teaching and research mission, but probably weren't established with the level of resourcing for their research as those earlier universities in Australia. A little bit smaller, like 30,000 students is actually quite large by perhaps English language countries like or Anglo countries, but that's not very large by Australian standards. Some of our universities are 100,000 students. About 22% of our students are international, which is a little bit below the average because the average is heavily skewed by a handful of universities. We've been as an association for 20 years, and part of my role is to work between the Australian government and represent our 7 members to influence policy. So when government's wanting to change the rules, regulations, funding, they will consult with the sector. The Australian Universities Australia represents the peak body for all the universities or public universities. Our membership we're a subgroup of that, and we advocate for things that are of interest to our members, and usually what's also in the best interest for the sector. We like to think that way. We've got about 5 staff, 5 to 6 full-time equivalent staff, and we have a subscription-based model. So they pay a fee, and that pays for people like me to work on behalf of the universities. We have a committee structure that's similar to what you'd see in an Australian university, headed by the vice-chancellors. So they have around 5-6 times a year. The vice-chancellors meet online or in person. We facilitate those discussions. Then they have deputies for Deputy Vice-Chancellor Academic or Education, those focusing on research. Those 2 committees are the ones that I manage mostly, and then I have subgroups as well. Australian universities are quite unique in having a large number of international students. So we have a Deputy Vice-Chancellor International at pretty much all Australian universities. There's an emerging group of Indigenous or First Nations Australians, Deputy Vice-Chancellor level appointments, and DVCs or Deputy Vice-Chancellors corporately or Chief Operating Officers. Australian context. So we have 44 universities and about 160 or more other higher education non-university providers. When we talk about higher education, we're talking about, we have a qualifications framework, but basically you've got diploma courses which are below your bachelor. They're offered within the vocational education sector, so it kind of overlaps a little bit. Some of these higher education providers, primarily sort of skills-oriented training colleges, but most education at a diploma level and above, I've got there 91% of all higher education students are enrolled at universities. 1/3 of students are international, 2/3 domestic, 1.6 million. We have about 140,000 full-time equivalent staff. Australia's a little bit unusual that most of our staff are in administrative roles like mine, and not in academic roles. And perhaps as an example, I moved across from an academic role. That role ended and now I work on the administration side. But perhaps it's a little bit not usual or typical around the world that many of our professional staff are directly involved in supporting the teaching and research mission, assisting with curriculum, online education provision and research grants and management and funding opportunities. 75,000 in ongoing contracts. Most of the ongoing contracts are not academics, which is a big challenge because developing an academic career involves this sort of two-stage process that you'll find in many countries, but the first stage being on insecure contracts. 40,000 limited term contract staff, many of them are postdoctoral researchers, research professors, industry professors, not the typical teaching and research academic pathways. And then we've got around half of our teaching is done by about 22,000 casuals. That's across all different work categories, but they do about half of all teaching. They don't do the subject coordination, but in terms of face-to-face contact hours, it's quite heavily dependent on people on hourly based contracts. In terms of finances, the whole sector has about 40 billion Australian dollars. One Australian dollar is about 5 Hong Kong dollars, so it's 200 billion university revenue. 1/4 roughly comes from international student revenue, which is high. It was also very variable. So our regional universities might have less than 5% of their revenue from international students. Some of our city-based ones have perhaps 40% of revenue. When I say 37 or just over 1/3 from government grants, separating that out from what domestic students pay, that's become a more vague area because domestic students sometimes pay their fees up front, sometimes they take out loans. Those loans are income contingent loans with the government, so government pays their fees on their behalf and they may not repay their loan because they may not earn enough money to repay it through the tax system. So that would effectively be public funding, but it's captured as domestic student fees. And more recently, in a fairly popular or populist approach from the centre-left government, they have waived 20% of all student debt. So what looked like private contributions from students through loans really has become public contributions. 11,000 Australian dollars is the average student contribution or tuition fee. Then the government makes a contribution to universities for roughly the other half, around 11,000 on average, to cover the cost of teaching. Graduate outcomes are pretty good or pretty bad, depending on your perspective, but they're just under 2/3 complete within 6 years. 1/4 drop out, most of them in their first year. And because we've got an increasing number of part-time students, around 13% still enrolled.
So there are 44 universities or including 160 that other providers?
No,
it's only for 44 universities.
Actually, this revenue here is around 37 public
37
universities that report their finances to the Australian government. I think it's around 37.
Still 25% drop off. Oh, research.
Yeah.
Oh,
Oh, sorry, yeah, for the dropout rate, about 25% who enrolled in first year don't graduate and drop out. 13% are still enrolled after 6 years. We've got like 9-year data as well. Not a huge, like that 13%, it edges up. It's probably downwards, we'd say. Maybe it's maybe a third to a half of them end up graduating, and others just don't end up with a diploma. Some we don't really know their pathways, but we can't track people once they drop out. Then just a few other stats there, I think, on employment outcomes satisfaction. We take them for what they are, if that's good or not. The final point was just PhD stipends, 34,000 is only around a third of what a person with a PhD working in a university gets. Fair enough, it's tax-free, but it's quite low and it's not attracting very many domestic Australians to do PhDs. And professors can get paid up to a base salary of just over 200,000 Australian dollars. Vice chancellors get paid a lot more than that as well, and roughly $1 million Australian dollars, or maybe a bit less at ranges, but there's quite a big range within the university of what people are getting paid. It's not particularly equal. Student contributions. This slide is just showing that if you're enrolled in humanities and social sciences, on the left-hand side, you're paying $17,000 a year, and over 90% of the total funding a university gets for the student comes from student contributions, compared to, say, agriculture, which is less than a third, $5,000 a year to study agriculture or nursing or teaching or English. So in recent times, there's been a big separation between what you study and how much you pay. Historically, it's not been very different. The student contributions, depending on what you study now, there's a big concern. Well, and this is by design. The previous conservative centre-right government didn't want to incentivise certain courses. Yes, I've got a question. That is before tax. Yeah, I imagine the marginal tax rates are around about 40%.
40%.
That's the marginal. So for each additional, once you get over about 100, probably 140,000, it goes up to 40%. But then there's lots of marginal rates below that. And that's the base salary. Some get loadings. There's 17% goes into a retirement. In addition, 17% goes into a retirement fund that we can access. So,
What, too high?
The salary structure, I should declare that these are my opinions, not the views of the universities I work for, certainly not the vice chancellors that we work for. But I would say that the challenge with the structure of staffing in Australia, the biggest challenges are at the bottom. Our casual teaching staff are paid less than they should. Whether the people at the top are paid more than they should, and if you're going to increase the pay at the bottom and you don't get a whole lot more money from government or from students, you're going to have to find it from somewhere, and it's not really the professors or the vice chancellors or anything in between there that are struggling to meet the kind of what they would earn if they were working outside the higher ed sector. Well, we can come back to that. This very briefly, this is just showing the red is the median international student fees. The blue is the domestic revenue. So that's student contributions plus the government contributions. The point is, for every international student, they bring in about double the revenue to what a domestic student does. That creates at least a perception of a conflict of a governance problem or conflict there, where maybe there's soft marking or for international students who are encouraged to continue to enrol because they bring in a lot of more revenue as a student. Yeah, this is just the trends in the relativities between government grants and student fees over time. International student revenues bumped up again in 2023. I've updated that slide though. What's the university? That's how they look, pretty typical, built in the model of your traditional English universities, some of them now in city campuses. What's not a university? The universities have, there's a requirement for who can carry a university title. The Australian Cannabis University is not a real university, even though it has a bit of a slogan there, learn, grow, build, innovate and cultivate. That would probably, a regular university could have that sort of slogan to it. We have clear requirements for who can carry the title, and universities must engage in research across multiple fields of education at world standard in most fields or above, be comprehensive, and they are what we call self-accrediting. So they can, if they want to open up a new course, they can do it without any government approval. They're self-governing. And as you move further up there for university, within the university category, we should say we've got specialised universities as well. So they don't have to be comprehensive, but yeah, so there are some subcategories for universities there. University colleges are just sort of less mature. They self-accredit. They're allowed to accredit their own for about 70% of their courses. And then there's the other institutes of higher education providers. They still have a commitment to academic freedom of speech. They have to, the staff have to demonstrate an engagement with scholarship, but most of their courses, we have a regulator that will check to make sure that their courses are up to standard before there's a need for them, before they get accreditation. Enrolments, self-explanatory. This includes international students though. They have increased dramatically since the 1950s. This is just for domestic students. The proportion of all students that are domestic, no, sorry, this is forget about that. This is participation rates. This is the proportion of young Australians who enter higher education. It's gone from about 15% in the 1970s up to around 40%. Today, there's a big ambition that it will get up to probably around 55% by 2050. Most students are female, but certainly back in the 1950s, there were big problems when 80% of all students were men. There were various reasons why that would have been a bad reflection of how society was. We're now at sort of levels of gender inequality we saw in the 1970s, but you know, with females being much more likely. But there's been a recent push towards improving equity in Australian higher education. This is not really an example of equity because when the male underrepresentation, and also we could say the underrepresentation of Australian-born people are much less likely to go to university as well compared to those who are born overseas. It's not because they're disadvantaged, typically. There's something else going on that's dissuading them from making the choice to enrol in higher education. And unsurprisingly, attainment rates, those that get higher education degrees, around over half of all females in Australia, 25 to 34, have higher education degrees, less than 40% of males. And yeah, there's been this trend in more international students. The only kind of counter trend was during COVID when we locked down the border, but things have picked up again. And like we've seen in the UK, lesser extent US or in a different way in Canada, there's concerns that maybe there's too much immigration in Australia and international students are a part of that and there should be fewer of them. So we're facing that discussion now. One other trend is we've had a declining number and proportion of enrolments from those from disadvantaged backgrounds. I know this, we don't have time to go into too much detail here, but there's different categories of students, particularly it would be the low SES, the dark blue line. This is the total numbers. So as higher education has kind of increased in number, we've got fewer students from low SES backgrounds. And this current government's want to do something about that. On research, this chart is just showing public funding by university. The colours represent the groups, the innovative research universities in red. Group of 8 are the oldest research intensive ones. They get about 2/3 of all research funding, public funding, competitive grants, and then block grants. That seems to have always been the case for the last couple of decades. yeah, so that's just how it is. They get most of the money, but one counter trend that hasn't probably isn't, it's certainly not the same in Canada or the UK where I've looked. This is using research output with the Leiden ranking. 2/3 of all research came from the group of 8 about 15 years ago. Now it's down to 55%, with the rest of the sector kind of producing a bit more. And it's not just research output. If you look at highly cited research, it's the exact same trends. This sort of decline from our research, most research intensive relative to others. Sure, there are limitations in all of these things, but we've had I think a pretty strong performance on growth and research coming from newer universities and those established like in the 1960s, 70s, 80s. So recent policy developments. Before going into it, maybe you're familiar with Clark's triangle of coordination. I've also put up Ben Youngblood's churning triangle as another example. So when thinking about how a higher education system is directed, who decides how many students there are, what students are taught the curriculum, whether a university can, which students get to go in to the university, what they choose to study, what research universities should do. It could be directed from the state, and in 1983, the USSR was identified by Clark as that sort of typical example. Or you could have, the government give the money to the universities, and then the academics elect their leaders and their presidents or their vice chancellors, and they decide what research they do, which students are taught and what they're taught, and if taught badly or better. With Italy seen as an example of a type of that. And then the example of the market system where there's no clear directive from any particular group. It's an exchange that's between the staff, the academics and the students, and what society wants in terms of research. That was a snapshot in time. The reason why I've just put up Youngblood's triangle there is that he sort of adapted that to talk about how systems can move between market-oriented policies or ones which provide the academics and the institutions with control. So an example would be at the time Netherlands was discussing about a voucher system. So public funding that students would then decide where they enrolled, and that would be a type of pushing things more towards the market, even though it's public funding. And the last one, I just put Salazar and Leahy's Microcosmographia. Good article, not so good title, but they made, I'll shift on to the next slide, but the key advance that they provided was that rather than looking at it, the state as an example, as a coordinator, you must understand that there are the politicians, there's the administration, and then there's the populace or the citizens. And within that vertice, there's tensions between those. And we've certainly seen that recently in Australia with politicians having a stronger ambition to direct what students study and what research gets funded to a lesser extent. And certainly within the academic oligarchy or the institutional vertice, that domain, again in Australia, we've seen a sort of a shift in academic leadership towards professional leadership, certainly since the 1983s when Clark was writing about these things. And they have different interests, the leadership of universities relative to academics over which students should be admitted and what they should be taught. If your course is not generating very much demand from students, should it still operate? Well, academics would say it's their freedom to teach what they know, and student demand's not that important. I won't go into the competition domain. I think that's something that can be explained elsewhere. Finally, but this is the sort of last slide before I get to the recent developments in Australia, but thinking about what is a higher education market, again, I recommend you have a look at Youngblood's article because I enjoyed it, and I think it still has a lot of relevance. So if we think in Australia more over the past few decades, a market would be where there's freedom of entry for new universities to come in and compete with the established ones. We haven't seen that. Very few universities have been established. Those that have, they've been very specialised, often around religious education. A market would involve universities having the freedom to specify their project, their product or their course. Now, we do have that in Australia. In the Netherlands at the time when Youngblood was writing, they didn't have self-accrediting, so they'd have to go to government to get approval to start up a new master's program or something. So we've had that element of the market quite strong for quite a while in Australia. Freedom to use available resources, that's also been very strong in Australia. Our universities, as I was showing, more than perhaps for some universities, 40% of their revenue coming from international students. They bring that in and then they decide how they want to spend it. Some public funding, they don't have the freedom. They're kind of custodians of public assets. But universities have been able to go out there and provide services, rent out space on campus and generate revenue for their own purposes. And freedom to determine prices, that's a tricky one. Heavily regulated for domestic undergraduate students in Australia, not at all regulated for international students, somewhat regulated for postgraduate students in Australia. From the student perspective, there needs to be a freedom to choose which provider you've got. In about 15 years ago, we had what was called a demand-driven system, which was very close to what would be considered a voucher model. Students would decide they would apply to universities. The universities could enrol as many domestic undergraduate students as they wanted, as long as they were well prepared, suitably prepared students. And the government would pay the government contribution and the students would pay the student contribution or get the loans to do it. It created a lot of competition between universities. And that created some concerns from those institutions that weren't growing, not through their own choice, but because others were kind of growing it. Stealing their students is an extreme way to describe it, but definitely an example of where the student freedom had been increased. Freedom to choose product doesn't really apply very well in any, I think, higher education system. Students have to enroll in a Bachelor of Commerce or dentistry, and they can't move from one course to another very easily, or from one university to another. And that's something which the Australian government's really pushing towards, is to break down some of that so that there are exit points. People can do diplomas in vocational institutions, get credit for a university degree and finish with a bachelor degree. We haven't seen the success of it yet, but that's certainly on the agenda in Australia. There's been a lot of pressure or belief that if we provide more information to students about the quality of the courses through surveys, the costs, the graduate outcomes, they will make better informed decisions. And then those vouchers would go to the better providers. The downside is that students, from the political point of view, chose courses that the politicians didn't like. So they weren't like lots of students enrolling in nursing and teaching and for some like Australian history or something, but they were enrolling in commerce and lots of law schools that became established. They were responding to student demand. And then government starts getting involved and saying, well, we're going to double the price of humanities degrees to dissuade students from enrolling in those courses. Final point, covering costs, covering the prices paid is kind of separate, but it's more about if you pay your fee to study in that particular course, that money should be kind of sent back to you in the service towards that course rather than cross-subsidisation. And the Australian government is really concerned about universities cross-subsidising by charging lots in their business courses to pay for their history courses that have very few students. So yeah, the recent system, probably in the last 15 years, there's a push towards market with this sort of like voucher type system for domestic undergrads. The the fees were capped, so the gap the students would pay. For domestic postgrads, similar voucher in the sense that they could take out student loans. Some, they genuinely got government support for their studies, but the fees that they were charged, there's no restriction on what universities could charge, other than if they charged more than what the loan cap was, more than a student could take out a loan for with the government, then they'd face upfront fees. So universities didn't do that. They'd get fewer students. And international students have very much been in a market, not just for the setting of the prices, but in practice, I think, and I could be wrong, universities were able to enroll international students as long as they met the standards of entry and had the money to pay the fees. They could probably get the visa to come to Australia to study those degrees. And that's why we've seen a large growth in international students, and sometimes disproportionate growth from certain markets where universities have done well setting up hiring agents in cities around the world to encourage people to think about coming to their university to study.
Sorry, Peter, so can you explain a bit more about voucher, how it whole things work? Like, so what is the kind of voucher? It's kind of subsidy for whole families, or like? No,
this is I could go back to one of the slides. So the slide that showed humanities students had a student contribution of 17,000 and a government payment of 1,000. That 1,000 is the equivalent of a voucher. It's the government's contribution towards the cost of the education, and the student contribution is the 17,000. Now, if that student chose to enroll in agriculture, then the government's contribution was something like 35,000 and the student contribution is about 5,000. It meant that whatever a student wanted to enroll in, they could get, the university would get funded for that place.
It's not for the family or student.
Nothing to do with the
university.
It's to pay for the cost
of education.
It doesn't involve like living, anything like that. It just meant that it was demand driven or student driven system. So how the government and no one decided that we should have lots more law students. What actually happened, lots of students enrolled in allied health courses and commerce courses, and all of those students received a public subsidy. So please.
The percentage of the voucher varies among all of us.
Yes. Yeah, the percentage and the actual amount, because the cost of teaching an agricultural student is more than the cost of a humanities student. So it was, I mean, it doesn't, I don't know if there's probably others who might say that I've got it completely wrong to describe it as a voucher system, but certainly there's a public subsidy that follows the student, or it had up until very recently, when in 2018 the government capped the amount of funding a university could get for the government contribution, which meant universities could enroll students, but they'd only receive the student contribution, not the government contribution. So it started getting a bit complicated, and then recently the centre-left government didn't like that universities were growing beyond their, with student contribution only, and so then they said the new model is not going to allow you to even charge student fees for students above your maximum government grant. It does get complicated, and if we got time, I can certainly try to explain it better. Just on research, I think research in Australia has primarily been academic driven. Government doesn't tell you what to research. A lot of the grants, for competitive grants, were based on excellence. Your peers would decide which ones get the grants. But in the last 15 years, there's been more of a block grant from government started incentivizing research that had end users or engagement research, research that's co-funded by business or government departments. So it started shifting more towards market. I think, and we'll get to a bit later, the recent changes are trying to get research to align more with national objectives of government. This is just the student contribution rates since they were introduced in 1989. Key thing, they started out with one flat rate around $2,000 a year. It didn't matter what you studied. Then it split out into 3 bands in the mid-1990s, with the higher charging bands, typically courses that had better earnings outcomes for graduates, so capacity to repay your loan, you'd pay more for those courses. Then in 2021 onwards, with what's called job-ready graduates, they separated it out. So you had this big difference between your education student paying $5,000 a year to your humanities student paying $17,000 a year. Politically, it's become like dynamite. No one likes it, but it's really costly for government to change it. So government wanted to change things. Labor government came in, it did a big review of higher education, it kicked it off in November 2022, releasing terms of reference that set out what the government was sort of thinking, needed more graduates with skills, wanted access for disadvantaged background students. It was a bit concerned about the governance of universities having too many people from business backgrounds and not enough, those who are academics or those with understanding of the higher education system in charge of universities. Some issues around quality. These things come back later on in the review. It's just almost the only reference to research was, again, about knowledge, innovation, making better use of our excellent research capacity. A few months later, they put out, well, in between that, there was like a consultation on the terms of reference. People wrote to the government on that. Then they put out a discussion paper, which was relatively brief by government standards for this, 44 pages, but it had 49 questions. It was asking the sector, what do you think about all of these, how we can do better to meet the national needs and improve teaching and learning, again, and around those terms of reference for research and innovation. We waited and they released an interim report around, I didn't put the pages there, about 160 pages. It had lots of recommendations. But it identified 5 priority actions that needed to be addressed straight away. Each of those 5 are pretty minor tweaks. The minister talked about this, it's an echidna, having spiky background, or spiky ideas. They were contained in it, but the priority actions were pretty small. So regional study hubs, that's to help regional students get better access to higher education. The 50% pass rule really just made it easier for universities to retain students who were failing more than half of their courses in their first year. Rather than automatically saying these students shouldn't receive public funding through their subsidy or you shouldn't be able to keep enrolling them, it said, look, we trust universities to be in a better position to make a judgment about whether the student just failed a fair few units because something happened in their life that prevented them. So it was well received from the sector, not well received by the Conservative government. They hated it. We're going to bring it back if they got one election. Demand-driven funding for First Nation students. So when, as I mentioned, we had the voucher system, then they capped the total amount of funding. So you can imagine if you have vouchers for everyone who can enrol in universities, it costs the government a whole lot of money, and they don't believe that invest $1 and you get $5 back in 30 years' time. That's what the university sector likes to say, but in practice they just see it's costing us money. And they basically extended all vouchers. Any First Nation student who met the requirements for a university study would get access to a place. Continuity guarantee is the block grant for teaching students was dependent on the number of students you enrolled. During COVID, there was so many troubles for Australian universities. The government just said, we'll pay you even if you don't have those students there. And this was just a way to extend that for a bit longer. And now they're in the process of winding that back. And as I mentioned, governance was a concern for them. February last year, they released a massive final report, eagerly awaited, and then it came out and it took a long time to read through. The executive summary must have been about 50 pages. They even released a summary report for the final report. 47 recommendations, far more than that in practice because there were lots of sub-recommendations. I've just listed maybe 6 of the relatively more important ones, or the ones that are more likely to actually be implemented. The key one is they wanted to establish a tertiary education commission. So we have a Department of Education, which is your bureaucracy. We have a Minister for Education, which is your politician. There was a view that we needed policy that extended beyond the political cycle of 3 to 4 years and set the system up for what we need in 2050. So let's create a different bureaucracy that is separate to, that sits between the university sector and government and the politics side. I'll get to that a little bit later. They also set targets. They like the idea of setting targets and interim targets. How are we going to get there? Who knows? But it was a big part of it. A new funding model, which becomes far less driven by student enrolments, more driven by this ATEC deciding how large universities should be and where the growth should be, which universities should be allowed to grow, which ones should not, depending on performance, things like that, with needs-based funding for disadvantaged students. Every disadvantaged student, the university would get more money so that they can then provide better support to those students. Lots of strings attached, you could say. They were really concerned about student contributions, like that chart I was showing, 17,000 a year for humanities students, and reforming the higher education loan program repayment. There's a lot of concern in the community that people were struggling to repay their debt, and that was actually a flaw, not part of the design. Like an income contingent loan is designed that if you don't earn the money, you don't repay, and the government, the public, is paying for your education. But they wanted to, reduce repayments for graduates. International education got some mention, mostly about aligning international education with the skills needs of Australia and growing it in regional areas rather than having so many in Sydney and Melbourne and Brisbane. Some concern around diversification, too many students coming from China and India were too dependent on a handful of markets. Subsequently, the discussion changed a lot. It became not so much about these things, but more about are there too many international students for immigration purposes, irrespective of where they're coming from, what they're studying, or where they're residing. They announced a strategic examination of research and development. They also had lots of other research recommendations, and they, as far as I'm aware, that all got bundled into this strategic examination of R&D. So in May, soon after, so it came out in February, in May they had the budget, and subsequently an update budget in December, the end of last year, where the government claimed we've already responded to 29 of the 47 recommendations. But then they say in full and in part. So in part, like interpretation, partly could be very minimal. And they didn't say which of the 29, which kind of made it difficult for people like me trying to track this stuff down. One thing they certainly did was establish this ATEC, Tertiary Education Commission. And they did a fair bit around cost of living relief, paid for students doing nursing, education, psychology, some other social work who had placements. We had to do full-time experience in the workplace. they introduced payments for them so that they would they'd be able to afford it. It wouldn't be a barrier for them graduating. And they did some things around loan reform, introduced new funding, or planned to introduce a new funding model, established a governance council to be concerned about student safety as well. Or student safety, and ombudsman for student complaints. You can think of these things also in terms of markets like consumer protection. And then this examination of R&D. Things that weren't mentioned in the accord, but did get support in the budget, quadrupling higher education disability support. That was very welcome, about 50 million Australian dollars a year now going into disability support. One-off, no one asked, no one recommended in the accord, debt write-off for students. It was all about reducing student contributions. Those really high charging courses needed to, can't be charging 17,000 a year. But the government's response was, we're going to cut student debt, which benefits all of the people who finished education some time ago, people who have done MBAs or some other courses and racked up loans. And it was very effective because it was announced in December 2024. We had an election, I think, earlier this year, and that wins you more votes. Well, cynically, that it wins you more votes to wipe off student debt than to reduce student contributions for current and future students. International education, no one asked for it, of course, but they set a cap on international students and a plan to allocate each university as a number of students that they could enroll in international. Just skip through this. This is kind of my idea. Again, I like the Jung article here citing someone else, but to think about coordination, once you introduce an ATEC or a commission, Australia's had like this kind of roundabout approach where people find their own way to their exit. They come in and then they go. The hope is that ATEC is going to be directing where students go, which institutions get more. It's more like a traffic light system. And for that to work well, you've got to have the technology and you've got to have the data, and you have to have things working dynamically. And it's going to be a big challenge because right now we are midway through 2025. Earlier this week, the government minister released how student numbers have been growing with preliminary data for 2024. It's been 6 months. We're in 6 months into 2025. And the certain data, the public data, the certain data is still only 2023 numbers. So how they're going to set, how many students the university should have when we are lagged 18 months today, and they're planning for their student enrollments for 2026. We've got a long way to go. I don't want to be cynical about it, but I think the kind of, it's going to be a challenge for them. These are the 4 roles, broadly, of what the Tertiary Education Commission is supposed to do. Help set targets. Compacts are these agreements, mission-based agreements with institutions. Right now, we've got them with no funding attached, so they just don't really influence the system too much. I think they are going to start to influence. There will be some, indirectly or directly, some funding attached to that. ATEC will advise the government on the suitable pricing of courses, what students should be allowed to be charged, the skills, work with another government department, agency to determine what the skills needs in the future are going to be. And they'll be analysing performance at an institutional level to determine how much your grant is going to be, or how much whether you as an institution should grow or be capped. Will inherently have some element of performance management. So I put a few little arrows where I was thinking within that public domains. I think the idea for the commission is to remove some of the politics. Whether it shifts anything between the institutional and the public, I think academics, both academics, university leaders, the bureaucracy and the politicians probably all think that the Tertiary Education Commission is going to work for their interests, but we don't know how it's going to really operate, whether it's going to strengthen academic control or not. So that's something that will come out. But it's definitely removing some of those competitive elements rather than students going to institutions that they want to go to. This is more about the higher education funding, the new managed growth system. It's definitely a shift away from the more market voucher oriented, where for both international students with caps at an institutional level, that's going to be set by government or by ATEC, not by what, how much demand there is for students to study at certain institutions, and likewise for domestic students. So there'll be less competition, a little bit more control, whether it's state control or whether it depends on whether you consider this independent commission to be representing the interests of the government or of the institutions themselves. And if they set, say, a target to increase the number of mechanical engineers because the economy needs it, then their ability to reflect the market needs will depend. How well they do that will depend. Will have an impact on whether the market for skills is aligned with where the funding is going. Finally, with research funding, this strategic examination of R&D, it's not about, all the indications so far, it's not about putting more money into universities to do research that academics want to do. It's about how can we get more of the research that we're currently public is funding in universities to be aligned with what the government sees as kind of our industry policy. Australia, Australia gets a lot of sunlight. We should be world leaders in solar panels and solar technology. Government might set that agenda and say we need to therefore have more of our academics doing that sort of research. All right, final slide. Where the future system might be looking, I think with an ambition for an 80% tertiary attainment rate in Australia, and we will most likely have a larger system going forward with more students from previously underrepresented backgrounds. But most of the things that the government's doing are supply side issues. They're not addressing the demand, the increasing the desire to study in higher education or making higher education more relevant. Or there is some work on outreach, we call it, so increasing aspiration. But the government can throw a lot of money into having lots of university places available for people in certain courses. But if there's not the demand for it, for whatever reasons, good school preparation, or whether there's better jobs out there that don't need higher education, we're not necessarily going to have a large system. Definitely, I think it'll be more managed. I think more technocratic, with bureaucrats and experts, perhaps like myself, trying to guess, well, what do we need? What sort of courses should we be promoting? Which jobs will require a higher education degree in 2050 or something, and trying to plan for that. Institutionally diverse sector, there's a strong emphasis I mentioned on that market slide about student choice, being able to package their course, like choose what product they want, start in a vocational provider, move towards a higher education provider, pull out, exit at different points. This is all part of this kind of tertiary harmonisation, somewhat increasing competition between institutions, between the higher ed and the tertiary sector, so that you've not got this kind of monopolistic or oligopolistic control from the universities where they go, we're not going to recognise your prior learning in a vocational program or your life skills. It's that the government's trying to break that down so that people can move more seamlessly between. And I think that will lead to a more diverse sector, both with universities changing what they're doing, providing more stackable courses like start and exit points, as well as others entering and doing some of the higher education that are not university providers. I suspect we're going to get more teaching focused, or universities that are funded just for the teaching mission. At the moment, the university category requires really extensive research. and that's created a barrier for entry. But the government, I don't think, is going to be willing to pay the cost of the research mission as the system expands. And I don't think they're going to be willing to say that students should be paying the cost of the research. They think the students should be paying for if they enroll in a particular course and it's got certain fees, that should be paying for the staff that come to teach them, not to pay for the staff to do research or some other staff to do research. Prestige hierarchy, yeah, I can't imagine that. I think we are going to see a stretching of that, pure because research funding is concentrated. Uncertain with international student, it's still, probably a lot of that goes to those research intensive universities. Whether the government makes some changes there, that could flatten some of the hierarchy within the university sector, but probably not going to happen. I think Australia's not going to, in terms of its international students, I don't think it's going to collapse. I think the basics are right. There'll still be demand to come to Australia. We've got a pretty strong base standard for our universities. And I think my guess is that this will pass. We won't see the same rapid growth we've seen before, but we will continue to see some growth. So that's it from me. I've gone long enough.
Would you like to see it? It's a small group, so maybe you can take a seat and
I
then we
will
can talk,
take
right?
my coffee.
Yeah, please. Yeah. Oh,
But have we got? I don't know if we've
yeah, we
got
have
anyone
enough.
online.
Yeah, guys. Yeah, should take it. And then any questions? Feel free to ask any questions.
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, and thank you for sharing, Professor. I think it's a very interesting topic, and we have learned a lot about the Australian higher education system. And I'm interested in one point. You just said that the Australian politicians, they can direct what to study in the universities. So I'm wondering how to guarantee the academic autonomy in the university and how to balance the relationship between the government and the universities. Okay, thank you.
Okay. So the government can't decide what is contained in a curriculum.
Oh, yeah.
That's completely all the autonomy of universities. What during our voucher type demand-driven system, the government didn't decide how many engineers or how many teachers were being trained. That was determined between students and universities. But as they've kind of introduced a cap on the total amount of funding, what they've done is said, okay, this is the cap. To grow, we know that there's more demand out there. We're only going to provide growth for particular courses that they think are aligned with the national interests. Because let's say, despite the sector growing, we still have a shortage of teachers in regional Australia. Therefore, there'll be more teacher education places. And teacher education is a good one because with a centre-left government, I think they're much more likely to say, leave it to the academics to do what's appropriate for teacher education. The centre-right were really trying to criticise universities and say, you should, when you're training teachers, they need to spend more time in the classroom and you need to teach them, how to really, I can't remember the terms around types. Let's say not sit down and shut up and listen to the teacher and rote learn stuff, but none of this like students having power over their own learning, like really have it much more structured approaches. So the curriculum will always be, I think, within the university sector, different for vocational providers, kind of directed by academics, but the number of places is starting to become more in control of government. I hope that makes some sense.
Thank you. Yes. So some online participant questions.
That's all.
I don't know if they can speak, but you can take a look and then I think you can directly answer. I think they can hear.
This address freedom. Well, I read Ahir's question.
Mhm.
I don't know the answer. The first part, manpower planning, it's much more national. I don't think that we're looking at international trends. Even for international students, it's about how do they contribute to the Australian manpower. How would this address freedom for students to nudging towards? I don't know how to answer that other than to say most of the attempts by government to nudge students in Australia towards any course have failed. Students choose courses that they're interested in. We hope that if you put information out there about graduate outcomes being you earn lots more as an engineer, you'd get more people studying engineering. That government would hope that, but students choose what they want to study. And there's no upfront fees, so it doesn't matter what the fees. Okay, I'm just going to read
feel
what
free, yeah.
Joshua Black.
Sure.
I'll just go through this. Data availability is a big concern for ATEC. Jurisdictional limit, yeah. So within Australia. Similar. Okay, well, I think there hasn't been a lot of budgets. It's not just that he's saying how will ATEC, this commission, be able to achieve its mission, given that Australia has a federal system of the national government funding higher education, universities being established as under state law. There's not a whole lot of budget for the commission to do that. I don't feel I can comment too much about the jurisdictional challenges, but the budgetary ones, I don't think the lack of money is the biggest problem. I don't think there's the capacity out there. Even if they had more money, there's not the people. ATEC this commission is going to be drawing a whole lot of staff out to the Ministry for Education. I believe they will become staff of the commission. They'll work for a slightly different boss, but sorry, I don't really have such a good answer for that. And the differences with the old Commonwealth Tertiary Education Commission, I don't think I've got the knowledge to say on that. And
Prof, question from Kohei, yeah. I think it's from the last part of you were sharing, like, yeah, it's more going for the teaching oriented funding support and how it's gonna affect missions, and are there any concerns actually? Yeah.
It's hard to think about the consequences of this. The public good research has been really hard for us to advocate. It's been really difficult. It's much easier to get the government to give more money for the higher education system to pay for students, to pay for training more nurses, to do the educational mission. It's the public good research often takes so long to show any particular public benefit, and it's hard to draw the causality to say, well, that was the result of infrastructure investment 30 years ago into blue sky type research. So we've seen a big decline. Maybe not in total expenditure on basic research in Australia, but certainly as a proportion of all research, it's declined since the early 1990s. Competitive grants are moving more towards that. Currently, we've got a system where there's earmarked funding for discovery-based research. There are plans to change that and to not have a separate fund dedicated to basic research.
Isn't there any this opposition and concerns? Because all other governments, they are trying to increase more money for the basic research, discovery, all these out of Asia, most like now it's very kind of research excellence, R&D funding increase. That's the trend, like as far as I see. So it sounds like a bit opposite direction. Are there any this opposition or concerns?
Australian universities have spent more research now than ever before. And they've done so because they've grown the international student revenue, they've grown the amount of research they do in collaboration with government, with business. It's not, some of that international student revenue certainly supports the public good research and the basic research. That's why they've been able to retain academics to do teaching and research, but not direct them what to do with their research, just pay them as part of their job. If we look at total research and development expenditure in Australia, it goes up and down and it's on its way down, but that's because business is spending less on research and development. And the goal is to how can we lift business expenditure on R&D with the same amount of money that we're currently putting from public for R&D. So how do you align the research that we're doing in universities with business needs? How do you get people who have research skills going out into industry and applying that to problems? So there's definitely, they've set a target to increase R&D as a percent of GDP. That's part of the accord. But the way to get there is not being seen as putting more, it's definitely not about putting more money into basic research or just giving universities more money to do research that they want to do. And it's expensive to pay people to do research and teaching. It's more expensive than just to pay someone just to focus on teaching. And as we shift to have more underrepresented students come in, there's a legitimate argument that they would have more chance of being successful in their education if they're taught by people who are doing research for half of their time, but are really focused on doing teaching.
Understand. Please, yeah.
Yeah, please.
I want to know, the domestic students in Australia, do they have like preference in choosing sub majors for the conference? Because the domestic enrollment rate is going down from 2001, and the Commonwealth contribution for different disciplines are different. So I want to know, the domestic students, do they have preference for entering certain subject?
Okay, so my understanding is you're asking, do students change their preferences depending on what the government or what student contribution rates are in those fields, those education fields? Short answer, my view is no, because we have income contingent loans that people don't think of it as debt. So when the fees went up for humanities and social sciences, for say business degrees, it didn't affect student demand. Others would say for disadvantaged background students, they're more attuned to, they're more debt averse, so they will change their preferences towards courses that are cheaper. But I think it's a really small influence. I think in Australia, like I showed the graduate outcomes, but I think it was around 80% in full-time employment within 3 to 4 months of graduating. The starting salaries are probably around 70,000 Australian dollars, which is pretty, good for someone who's in their early 20s. Unless you're enrolled into performing arts and the fine arts, there's not much difference between earnings after graduation, not a huge amount. The risk are the people that don't graduate. They earn less. People who don't have high earn less. So if you're trying to not, if I was to give someone advice, I would say, choose what you're interested in and make sure that, because you're more likely to graduate. Choose the university that's closest to where you live or you feel most comfortable about, because you're most likely to graduate. It doesn't really matter what university you choose or really what you study, because you graduate and then you'll probably have further education. Well,
about international students, because I thought that international students only in specific majors, they can find a job in multiple countries.
It's related to immigration policy.
yeah, like international students are very much influenced by price, because they've got money, and they will choose universities that charge. Whereas domestic students, because there are loans, all the universities charge the maximum that they can charge for domestic students. Same happened in the UK. If you increase the maximum, everyone goes to the top. And there's this perverse view that, if you charge less, then you're a lower quality provider. International students, it's different. They have to pay the fees themselves. They've got a variety. They may even need to be paying the fees through the work they're doing in Australia while they're studying. And if you're paying more fees, you're going to be really struggling. So for international students, the fee difference between providers is important. But many will move. Universities don't like this. They'll come to Australia and get a visa to study at a university, and then they'll transfer to a non-university provider that's cheaper and be able to carry that. My understanding is they'd be able to keep their visa to enroll in that cheaper provider. That's a market. That's the market operating. Universities, it's universities don't like it. I may be wrong how it operates, but they're very price sensitive. They enroll primarily in IT and commerce degrees. Those courses generally have decent graduate outcomes. They also, maybe a bit easier for people to graduate from, particularly if English isn't their first language as well.
John? What approach does the university adopt to assure the high performance of the universities, given that increasing taxations and also the consideration of university autonomy, like the universities may prioritize students' demand instead of government's recommendations.
So can you just repeat?
So what
My
approach?
Yeah.
What does the government adopt to ensure?
So we have a tertiary education quality and standards authority that are an independent, like this tertiary education commission. They're kind of a government body that are independent government, and they set requirements for universities. Can't admit students who have poor language skills or aren't well prepared. You can't admit students who are setting them up for failure. So that had been established in the about 10 to 15 years ago, as we moved towards a more marketized system, they wanted to put some constraints on the market and have a quality assurance agency that wasn't there before to ensure that students are not enrolling in old quality courses. There's formal requirements for universities to have certain governance structures and evidence of policies to demonstrate taking teaching seriously. But what was the what are the elements? I'm not sure I've answered your question. But thinking about that triangle, it's like certainly it moves it away from a market-based system, but it's not, the government's not in Australia is not directly controlling the quality and standards. It does kind of entrust an independent authority who are often stacked with university academics as advisors and former academics. So it kind of trusts that the quality assurance will be achieved through that. Interestingly, when the government wanted to first establish this commission, they put out a discussion paper that said the commissioners or the heads shouldn't have too much recent experience in the higher education sector because they felt that they could get a bit co-opted by their former friends and colleagues. That's no longer, I think, the plan for the commission. They realised that you don't want to have people come in to advise in higher education who don't have experience in higher education. It's not it shouldn't be seen as a negative experience, but we don't want it to be too close to the universities as well. But we see that there's some kind of conflict.
I just had one question about these casual academics in Australia. You said 22,000.
Yeah.
It's a huge number, right? How, so it's like hourly base, mostly teaching, or they also do, what's their scope of their work? And
Oh, thanks for asking, because it's like a topic that I really do take a lot of interest in. So 22,000, that was the total number of casual staff at universities. 90% of those would be teaching only. So then you've got some research assistants that are casual as well. Let's say you're right, a huge amount. That's full-time equivalent. So that's if a full-time person works 35 hours a week, you might have 7 casuals working 5 hours a week. So when it's so you may be multiplying that number by 7 to get it to be head count, the number of people. The accord or the final report is very critical of universities for being too heavily reliant on casuals. At the same time, I think they've been very cautious to say there's some statements in that 400-page report about how this is the responsibility of universities and unions through enterprise agreements through the industrial relations system to negotiate this. This is not the role of government to say you can't have casual staff or place those restrictions. So, the casual teaching staff at a rough estimate, and we do lack the data for this, and it should be, I think, a lot more transparent. Probably a third of the teaching work is by PhD students.
so
1/4.
1/3.
And probably 1/3 is by industry type professionals that hold a full-time job somewhere else and come in and they may be a co-supervisor on a PhD, they may be running seminars for how they may be a dentist that comes into the dental school and does that sort of stuff. And then a third might be kind of people who are retired, people who have finished their PhD but couldn't find another job. Really, this combination of those that have other sources of income through retirement or that's their main job. They paid at the, whereas a regular academic can move up the promotion chain from base salary of 100,000 to 210, teaching only casual rates are always pegged, always set based on the lower ranks, the hourly rates based on the rates at the bottom. So they don't, with more experience, they don't necessarily get paid more.
You do PhD in Australia, right?
Yeah.
And then, what, highly likely your first job will be in those casual academics, see?
If you do a PhD in Australia, you'll most likely have experience as a casual academic
At the very beginning
during
of-
your PhD.
During your
It won't be
PhD.
embedded in the PhD, and some universities, Monash University in Melbourne, kind of guaranteeing 1 day a week of work for the PhDs.
Oh,
So it's not kind of, it's taking away some of that casual work. I'm saying rather than like just trying to find people to do the marking
Yeah.
tutorials each year, start a semester, let's say we're going to use our PhD candidates in these roles, and we will make sure that they are adequately trained to do that.
and paid equally hourly based standard, so the payment is equal, like your PhD student or your postdoc,
No.
no, it's different?
Sorry.
Depending on qualification or
Yeah, well,
depending on the work?
Casual rates are based on the work,
Work, not
you
based
do,
on qualification,
not
okay,
made based on the
Qualification.
qualifications.
Okay.
It's only that if you're a regular academic, like when I was working at the University of Melbourne in a research role for 7 years. I got my PhD after working at the university, I think, 5 years. And as soon as I got my PhD, my salary moved up to the minimum they could pay.
yeah,
Whether my boss wanted to or not, the employment agreement with the union said, you've got a PhD, you've got to get paid the minimum. Casuals, I think whether you have a PhD or not, won't determine how much you get paid. It will be, are you doing lecturing, you get paid more than if you're doing marketing. If you're doing lecturing,
so all the international students, they also do that, like Monash, like those, they have a lot of Chinese PhD students there. So they also do the same kind of this teaching or marketing job, and then they get paid, or is it different, right, between Australian student, Chinese student?
well, it's a slightly different
Yeah.
discussion, but the most recent data we had, there have never been fewer Australian PhDs this millennia. So we're at a really low number of domestic PhDs.
They don't want to do it.
They're not going to do it.
Yeah, vote you.
All of the growth in PhDs in Australia has been from international students coming to Australia to do their PhD. Those who are Australian or domestic, they are much more likely to be doing it part-time than internationals. So they typically, such diversity, but someone doing their PhD part-time is often working full-time some
have
other
their
job.
job.
So they're not
Okay.
looking to do
It's
casual.
casual
So
also, it is.
it would usually be your full-time PhDs that will pick up some casual work.
They are international students.
They're restricted to, or international students are restricted in how much they can work. Australian PhDs are recommended not to do more than about 1 day a week of additional work. It would be great if we had regular surveys of PhDs asking them, what sort of work are you doing? I fear that a lot of PhDs, international ones, who come and don't have much, beyond the stipend, if they have it. Anyone doing a PhD full-time reliant on the stipend is doing it tough. And you're doing it way tougher if you haven't got some partner or family or something to rely on. And I fear that they're stuck doing menial jobs that prevent them from doing really well on the PhD in order to survive over the bills. But I don't know. I imagine the opportunities are there for internationals to do casual teaching, but it's also casual. It's a term for an employment contract, but it's also, you know, descriptor of the nature of how this employment is. It's like Professor Simon has, you know, doesn't want to teach this semester because he's got a big grant and who's his PhD students, or has anyone around here that's done this before? It's not very well structured. It differs. Some universities are way more structured for it, but for many, it seems to be really a risk. And the quality assurance agency, they see this as a risk if we've got too much reliance on casuals, if we've got too many examples of complaints about underprepared staff, all sorts of problems. Casuals and not just paid a lower hourly rate, they've been found to be not paid the rate they should be paid. They've been certainly found to be required to do more work than what could be done in the hours that were paid.
It's different, very different from how things work here. But we hear a lot of these stories because in Australian university you have a lot of Chinese students, PhD students, and first students, and they share all these stories. It's quite different from how things are done here. All right, well, we already passed the time, but yeah, if you want to talk to Peter briefly, you can stay a bit longer. But other than that, thank you so much for coming. And then Peter, thank you so much for the talk. And yeah, good. And thank you so much for the online participants. Yeah. Oh, good. All right. Thank you. And then we're gonna have a chat. We'll have a break for summer.
Awesome.
Yeah. So we will come back for the new seminars in September. Yes. Right. So July, August, all the members of Chera and online, we don't have seminar. Take rest, and then we come back on September. Yeah. All right. Thank you, everybody. Thank you.
Also, to tell you shows that the gender difference states and then say the human.
There are far fewer boys graduating